There were some technical issues that affected the moderator's quality of sound during the session, and the session host apologizes.
Hello, everyone. A very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you from wherever you're joining us in today's side event, where we're going to talk about solar radiation modification and youth perspectives on its governance, initiated by the United Nations. I am Asima Kamal Moni, a youth climate voice for emerging climate governance, and I'm honored to serve as the moderator for today's event, along with Paul. In today's event, we'll try to explore a better understanding and potential benefits of solar radiation modification, but also of the dire need for governance around the emerging technologies, which definitely requires transparent and participatory governance frameworks to ensure that it is consistent with international law, including human rights and environmental principles. Through this event, we would like to highlight the need for intergovernmental institutions to take responsibility for managing solar radiation modification, whilst ensuring the full participation of youth and the global south. We would present the potential negative environmental impacts and geopolitical risks deriving from unilateral SRM deployments, especially in times of multiple crises. And finally, we would raise discussions on whether focusing on SRM could hinder efforts to mitigate climate change or reduce emissions, and how youth voices could be better included in this governance. We will start the session by a short presentation from Hal and myself. Through this brief intervention, we aim to setting up the scene for today's event. We're going to start off with the fundamentals, like what is SRM, if you have never heard of SRM before, why we need to talk about it, and specifically, why are we talking about youth involvement. Then we have an exciting session planned where our experts will be speaking on a variety of topics. As part of the session, we will also be conducting 2 poll questions, one at the beginning of the experts intervention and another at the end. Following the polls, we will have an interactive panel session through question and answer, where you can ask our experts any questions you may have. So we hope to foster a productive dialogue that will deepen our collective understanding of these glass research technologies and its governance, and we look forward to your active participation in the discussion. Please feel free to post your questions in the question and answer box, which you can find in the Zoom underneath. And throughout the discussion, please feel free to post your questions in the box, and we will come back to them after the end of the experts interventions. Now, I will be handing the floor over to Hal, who is also moderating with me today. Before doing that, I would like to briefly introduce him. Hal Agar is an environmental science undergraduate at the University of New York. Throughout his studies, he has delved into a wide range of topics such as natural disasters, climate change, biodiversity, and geochemistry. Hal's current interests lie in exploring how knowledge of environmental threats, particularly climate change, is constructed and the interplay between knowledge and policy. He is currently pursuing a master's degree in environmental data science with a focus on machine learning approaches to mitigating environmental risks. Hal, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And I just want to extend my thanks to everyone who's found the time to join this webinar and talk about your perspectives. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of background. So when we talk about SRM, that's solar radiation modification. So this is a geoengineering technique that involves in temporarily limiting global warming by increasing the Earth's reflectivity. And it essentially aims to reflect some of the sun's energy back into space before it reaches Earth, sort of therefore reducing the amount of heat sort of absorbed by the planet. So why are we talking about SRM? Some people believe that it's a solution that is very plausible for tackling the main effects of climate change. For others, it constitutes a real danger. Part of this is the financial accessibility of it. It's a technology that is proposed that can be deployed by countries unilaterally or even by private companies. The issue lies within the fact that there is no current legal framework existing around the deployment and the use of SRM. So this is sort of where our debate is centered around and why we need to talk more about this topic. This brings us to our first major issue. It can be argued that geoengineering, more specifically SRM, does not tackle the root causes of climate change. And to expand on that, it doesn't tackle CO2 emissions or any of the other related problems, or some of the other related problems with climate change, such as ocean acidification. And it is considered as a sort of additional or last resort approach and not a substitute for the mitigation strategies we already have in place. So why are we talking about youth perspectives? And why are we in our webinar today? The main reason put forward for this is that it is essential to take in youth views, since younger generations are the future generations, and they are going to be the most impacted by any decision we make on SRM today. So it seems that it's compulsory to involve them in this sort of debate. Just some scientific assessment background. This is the sort of quote from the IPCC report that suggests that SRM may be a technology we need to start thinking about. And that's because our current mitigation scenarios might not be good enough to reach the sort of warming limits we've set by the IPCC. And to look further into that, there's sort of several strategies we've followed. The two main ones are mitigation and adaptation. But it is very clear at the moment that people are looking for additional approaches, and that includes SRM. And I'm just going to hand over to Asma now to continue.
So we did get to hear a sort of introduction of what is SRM, why we need to talk about it, and why we need to do it, right? I would just talk about the different approaches. I would start by talking about the different approaches which were discussed, and among the and why we and the there is maritime. So it basically involves spraying tiny seawater particles into low-lying clouds to make them more reflective and thus cooling the Earth's surface. We also have a cirrus cloud thinning, which is reducing the density of high altitude cirrus clouds, which trap heat and contribute to global warming. So yes, reducing the density of cirrus clouds. And then stratospheric aerosol injection, very widely discussed. And it is releasing reflective particles, especially sulfur particles into the stratosphere. And this basically mimics what a volcano eruption result to, like a cloud of sulfur particles in the stratosphere, which would reflect sunlight back into space and thus cool the Earth's surface. We also have surface albedo modification, which is very basic, and it just involves increasing the reflectivity of the Earth's surface by painting roofs, painting the pavements white, and thus increasing the reflectivity. Now, before talking about the potential benefits or risks of solar radiation modification, it is very important to keep in mind that knowledge gaps exist around solar radiation modification. So there are potential to reduce risks or introduce novel risks remains very poorly understood. Benefits could be that in their potential to reduce intensity of extremes of temperatures, as I say that it reflects sunlight back, thus cooling the Earth's surface. And also slowing the melting of glaciers and Arctic ice by reducing the amount of heated stock in the Earth's surface. And it is considered as potentially a very efficient, quick, and cheap way as a proposed additional measure to help alleviate the disastrous effects of climate change when we will reach a point of overshoot, when we will face the disastrous effects of climate change. So stratospheric aerosol injection, which I said that it involves releasing reflective particles into the stratosphere. This can be done relatively quickly and at a relatively low cost compared to other techniques. Now, talking about the risks. So one of the greatest risks that I find is people considering solar radiation modification as a single bullet solution, if they come to consider this as a single bullet solution to the climate change problem that we're facing, which absolutely is not. Solar radiation modification, it does not cause climate change, and it does not add to the actual problem of climate change. It cannot be considered as a solution to climate change, and that it can only act as a painkiller for a short time if properly governed and not a cure to the climate problem. Next, I'm going to talk about the moral hazard discussion. So policymakers also wish to address concerns that researching about SRM could distract, delay, or downplay the critical need for transformative emission reduction, the removals and adaptation, which can lead to a slippery slope, lead to a moral hazard problem. When SRM can outweigh the bigger block of concern, which is actually addressing the real problem and trying to solve that. So there is also this risk of moral hazard and getting into the slippery slope. Next, we will briefly talk about the potential risks of SRM. As previously said, I'll also mention that there is no international governance framework to govern these technologies. Also, there is a lack of research, knowledge gaps, as I said earlier. These last research technologies may also present a significant risk and limits from changes in biodiversity, from disrupted rainfall patterns, unintended climate, and it can also lead to geopolitical tensions, where SRM, solar radiation modification, could be viewed as a weapon or a new facet of neocolonialism towards developing countries, with a deployment that would be uniquely decided by the developed countries, building a country. Also, there is the termination effect or the termination shock. Here, the termination shock talks about the question that if any country ever decides to deploy solar radiation modification, and if the deployment would be consistent or inconsistent. For example, if a country decides to deploy stratospheric aerosol injection, and then 5 years later, somebody says to turn it up for a year, and then decides to go turn it back again. So these sort of changes will affect climate outcomes quite substantially. From where we started, from the disastrous effects of climate change, we might get into much worse position. And in terms of risk, there is uncertainty on how does the climate system respond to this technology, definitely how it affects all the things that we care about. And largely, then the human dimension problem, as I said. Next, the moral imperative. Scholars argue that in the face of a potentially urgent future political need for knowledge, it's a moral imperative to research solar radiation modification so that we can ensure sound information is available for our future generations, including decision makers on the potential risks and benefits involved. And also a recent 2021 study assessment by the US National Academies of Science highlights that research that advances understanding of the potential impacts of solar radiation modification on human rights should be consistent with the protection of such rights, which includes the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific research. So here is the question of moral imperative that people has the right to enjoy scientific research. So talking about and researching about SRM is also a moral imperative issue. And next, I'm going to end by mentioning some of the latest news about solar radiation modification. So very recently in February 2023, the United Nations Environment Program released a report warning that the world is not on track to meet its climate targets under the Paris Agreement. The report highlights the urgent need for countries to take action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to invest in renewable energy. Also, there is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which released a special report in 2022 on the potential use of solar radiation modification. In the report, it is highlighted that the potential benefits and risks of solar radiation modification, and it emphasizes that it should be viewed as a complementary approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions rather than a substitute. There is also a very new initiative called Make Sunsets, which has been greatly criticized for promoting solar radiation modification as a solution to climate change, and their approach is considered hasty, lacking proper governance, and so on. So yes, solar radiation modification is a very emerging topic right now. That is the end of our take. And now I will hand over to Carl to carry on with the first poll question.
So this is a poll for our audience, just to sort of gauge the some of the knowledge that we have listening today, so we can sort of cater this some of the discussion we're going to have a little bit better.
So the question is, how much do you know about solar radiation modification? If you think that you know nothing, then you choose the first one. If you know that you think that you know a little, the second one, a moderate option, a lot, both options. If you are an expert on solar radiation modification and its research activities, and the last option. If you could
All
click.
Yeah, and that's everyone who's replied. So having a little bit look at that, that's very evenly distributed, maybe a slight skew towards the less confident side, but hopefully that won't sort of, change how we kind of go on from now. I'm sure you can definitely participate in a lot of the discussion we're going to have. So, and we have one expert here as well. So very interesting.
Great. Now it is my great. Okay, so I am viewing the results now. Okay. Yeah. Great. Okay. So now it's my great pleasure to begin our expert interventions with our distinguished panelists. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Gideon Fitterman. I would briefly introduce him first. So Gideon Fitterman is a student in art sciences at the University of Oxford, researching the interaction of solar radiation modification and existential risk. He is currently a visiting researcher at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, where he is working on building scenarios of plausibly catastrophic near futures involving SRM driving or mitigating catastrophic risk. He has been involved in issues around solar radiation modification since he was 15, first advocating for governance of the technology and youth inclusion in debates around SRM, and later on in a more academic capacity, which has culminated in the past year of research. This has involved interaction with key actors in the SRM space, with Gideon having presented at a variety of events in the SRM space, having been interviewed for a number of media articles, and having hosted a number of podcast episodes on SRM. Gideon has presented his work on SRM at Council for Education in the Commonwealth, CEC 21, American Geophysical Union, AGU 21, and European Science Union, EGU 22. Gideon will provide us with valuable insights on the scientific evidence supporting the need for a deeper understanding of solar radiation modification. Over to you, Gideon.
Thank you very much, Asima. It's nice to be called an expert. I don't quite know if I would agree with that, that I am an expert, but I certainly, I'm just getting my PowerPoint right now, but I've certainly been working on the issues around SRM for a while. So thanks for that kind introduction. Is there a need for governance and research? And if there is, what is it that we need to know? So why do research? I'm going to briefly set out some of the justifications some people give for doing research. And then I'm going to be laying out some of the reasons we might be wary of research at this stage. So the first, one of the key reasons people suggest research is that large physical uncertainties remain in our understanding of the relevant systems to thinking about SRM. So we really don't understand aerosol behavior in the stratosphere very well, particularly aerosol behavior that isn't sulfates. We have some observations from volcanoes, but almost zero experimental evidence up there. We don't understand, so that can really impact our understanding of SAI. We don't understand cloud aerosol interactions very well, meaning that our understanding of both CCT and MCB is like substantially limited by that. We have little evidence as to what ecosystem impacts will be, both of changing in quality of light and in the, if particularly the case of SAI, the impact of the chemicals that we'll be putting up there. All of these we could at least significantly improve our understanding of with more research, in particular here with certain amounts of experimentation. Climate impacts of SRM are still uncertain in many cases. Yes, we've run a lot of models, but A, because of those physical uncertainties, but B, because the climate system is so complicated and our understanding of it is significantly improving, but still we have issues. Climate impacts are still highly uncertain. We don't really understand regional climate impacts very well. We don't understand the impacts on a variety of different climate tipping points. We don't have a lot of models of the climate impacts of things that are not SAI, and even then, only certain sorts of SAI schemes there are scenarios of. So our climatic impact, and we've still got limited understanding of other things, particularly at lower levels of high levels of resolution. So understanding what things like impacts on local water supplies will be, the sort of things that might be very relevant to people. We have still significant uncertainties about because we don't have the modeling. We've still run a limited range of scenarios. Sure, this has been improving, but nonetheless, a number of scenarios are highly unrealistic because what they try and do is get a strong signal of what SRM would be, meaning we're probably using SRM in a way that no one would use it because we're using too much all in one hemisphere, let's say, in a way that's a bit weird, or they're quite highly idealized. So they assume SRM would be implemented by one single global rational actor with no other cares except for like optimizing certain things in the climate system. There are there's some, but very few messy scenarios that have been run. And one thing I've been looking at, I've been running a workshop over the last couple of days looking at, okay, well, in what circumstances might we care about like messy scenarios? We've also run a rather limited range of scenarios with technologies that aren't SAI. So with marine cloud brightening and with cirrus cloud thinning, no scenarios, as far as I know, with a mixture of both marine cloud brightening and SAI, let's say, being carried out. We have engineering challenges. In some areas we could carry out. So we probably could carry out SAI relatively easily. Close to the moment, we still need to design the planes, but we're not far off. Some areas are much further off in engineering. It seems like we're still not in a particularly great state in understanding how to generate droplets from marine cloud brightening, for instance. So it's not even like the engineering challenges are all solved. And we also just have like a lack of experimentation that's a proof of concept. We don't actually, for some extent with SAI, we understand that it will work because we've seen it occur with Mount Pinatubo eruption, but we are much less certain around marine cloud brightening, which, although there is some experimentation going on down in Australia, this is still limited. Similarly, there hasn't been experimentation done in the stratosphere, particularly as well of SAI, meaning we don't really understand if you can indeed emit from a single point source or multiple point sources and the aerosols will spread or not. Another reason we might do research is because of the political impact of research. So for instance, this is part of the guiding philosophy behind the Degrees initiative, where we can, those who carry out research gain more power in the conversation typically. So allowing developing countries, for instance, to carry out research, not allowing, that's a bad way of putting it at all, not rather like providing resources and providing space in the conversation for developing countries to carry out research if they want to, might be like really important because at the moment, a lot of developed countries tend to not allow developing countries into the conversation, but allowing for promotion of research, not allowing again, promoting the pursuit of research there might help with this as well. Research provides information for policy informed by evidence-based risk analysis. This is essentially the underlying justification for research by most people who promote it. The idea that research can provide information for policy informed by evidence. Okay. However, there's reasons to be skeptical of research. Has a lot of dangers, and some of these have gone through, but it has others that I think are important. Scenarios that we run are not neutral. Typically, scenarios are run by people in the global north caring about the way that the work in the global, where these impacts in the global north will happen. And this is like limits the information that people in other countries can use to make policy on this. But also scenarios help create the futures that will further inform policy. Putting SRM into scenarios makes SRM a realistic policy in a way that might act to undermine other impacts or open things up. Scenarios are provide, so yeah, basically help to lay out the reality in which we make policy in, and so aren't neutral, and therefore carrying out certain scenarios over others is inherently risky. Moral hazard, we've discussed this earlier, and I'm sure people will be discussing this later as well. Just one thing, it's likely not on an individual level. Oh, you hear about SRM, so you have so you're less likely to mitigate, but rather is much more about systemic issues. SRM entering into the policy discourse around emissions, around climate change might deter mitigation. Putting SRM into integrated assessment models, if done badly, not everyone does this badly, some people try to do this very well and do successfully do this, but nonetheless might lead to it being the cheapest option to do SRM upfront and CDR a lot later, for instance, which might, and if CDR fails to materialize, this might put us off from mitigating and be particularly bad. Again, this isn't a deterministic reality. This also depends on the politics that goes on around research as well. SRM research almost certainly will normalize SRM. That might still be, it will reveal a lot of dangers, but a lot of research will normalize SRM as a realistic part of the climate policy. Also, SRM research will likely increase our capacity to deploy, our ability to, because we can understand the dangers better, and so we can have more attractive looking things. It creates a community that might want to scale it up because their livelihoods are reliant on it. And if you think SRM has inherent dangers or inherently ethically terrible, this might be a very bad thing. Some people might think normalizing SRM is an exceptionally good thing as well. In research dynamics, this establishes power relations that could impact later discussions. For instance, if all research gets centered in the US, on top of the US's increased power in international discussions more generally, if research gets centered there, they'll also have more expertise, more capacity to engage in negotiations around this, and more ability to shut out other countries. Coming back to this idea that the US might try its best to not allow other countries into conversations because it has the research, so it can make these discussions much more of its own as well. Also, another thing is less a reason not to do research, but rather research will not. It can help us, but it certainly won't resolve, particularly modeling research and physical science research, won't resolve the key geopolitical and social uncertainties around SRM. We might think that SRM's actor as a geopolitical tool, its capacity to cause conflict, is its key issue here. And so understanding the physical dangers, understanding the physical systems doesn't help with that at all, really. Then I'm going to quickly go into governance and the gaps of governance. So firstly, there is a variety of governance measures already in place around SRM, or that will be relevant to SRM. National law, so in the US, for instance, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, Weather Modification Act, and in other countries as well. There's significant amounts of regulation that would be relevant in an SRM context. Number two, we do have aspects of international law that will be relevant to SRM. So customary international law tends to control transboundary risks of technologies using things like due diligence standards. We do have treaties that will impact SRM. The Vienna Convention and Montreal Protocol will probably impact SRM and its impact on the stratosphere. I believe there was some discussion of this in the recent UNECE report. Although some other areas seem somewhat inappropriate for, say, the UNFCCC, because of its focus on greenhouse gas concentrations, CO2 concentrations even, will probably seem quite an inappropriate place to do this. Although the Paris Agreement, because it does have these temperature targets baked in, might be more of an appropriate place where we can tackle on SRM. There's also much more so than the formal governance, there's informal governance around SRM. There has been for a long time a taboo around talking around SRM. This is a form of governance. NGOs have often lobbied both in favor and against SRM. So SPICE and SCOPEX were shut down because of the work of NGOs and indigenous groups in lobbying, raising public awareness, things like this. We might have ethics boards. So again, one of the other reasons SCOPEX was shut down was because of its ethics board recommending this. Self-regulation of the knowledge network. which might include things like principles, norms, so things like the Oxford Principles, and stuff like this, will allow us to govern research. Although these informal governance, they typically don't govern deployment, because they're really governing the scientists and those in the knowledge network rather than state-level deployment, which is likely what we would see. There's also, as I said, still significant gaps. So low environmental impact research, the sort of experiments we might be talking about right now, whilst governed by informal governance, seem to not really be suitable for governance by formal measures. This might be fine, but might not be. There's little coordination done internationally on research. There's some, so there's GMIP, there's the Degrees Initiative, but nonetheless, more coordination internationally on research might be good. And one approach to this might be to take some sort of mission-driven research program as well, where we have an end goal of the sort of things we want to do. The program is of a limited time scale, it's not open-ended, with broad international input rather than, let's just say, a US-based program, which is certainly what the US Congress are trying to do at the moment, is a US-driven program. There's also there's no specialized governance of deployment. So there's little ability in current treaties or in the current international forum to coordinate on deployment of SRM if countries so wish. Similarly, to coordinate on stopping deployment as well. There's no international moratorium on this really as well. It's also very unclear what equitable deployment looks like and how to get this about, particularly in a world where you're increasingly, you've got the US and China increasingly taking interest in this, some in a military capacity as well. We don't really know how to govern very, very messy scenarios. We don't have the sort of measures that you'd want to be able to have the sort of idealized sort of single global rational deployer. And so we don't really know how to deploy this in that regard. And we don't have appropriate mechanisms in place or appropriate discussions happening that might leave us optimistic that sort of rational deployment could occur. And then there's also this really fundamental question around deployment, which is whether SRM will end up fundamentally being seen as a climate mitigation technology or as a fundamentally geopolitical tool. If it is if it is a geopolitical tool, this might make us more skeptical of our ability to govern this in a way that is equitable as well. Research and governance do co-evolve, which might be a reason to do research, but also is a reason to be skeptical of other sorts of research. So the governance object, the idea of SRM doesn't exist. It's been produced by this knowledge network. It is a result of research, produces the image, the idea of SRM and what we can govern it. This knowledge network is typically strongly based in the global north, particularly around Europe, the UK and America. Although increasingly, there's been a broadening of the community, although not necessarily a broadening of where funding comes from and things like this. So power dynamics still remain. Research informs decision-making within the governance structures. This is sort of the idealized reason why we should do research, because if we do research, the policy makers will make good policy. So that's how research can do that. Research can provide a testing ground for governance. This is why there's so much controversy over small-scale experimentation, partially because of a slippery slope people see between research and deployment, but also because you need somewhere to contest this technology, and research is often the place that this contestation happens. Research might establish power dynamics going on. This is, I think, some of the theory of change behind something like degrees, is that we want there to be more equitable power dynamics going on. So we want research to be able to be more equitable as well. We want to inform rational decision making around how to deploy SRM. Although there'll be people, perhaps even me included, that would contest that actually we will have rational decision making around this, or at least rational from a perspective of the climate. Research raises the salience of SRM, raising the need to govern it. So you see discussions going on around things like, the UNEP report, talking about like the need to govern experimentation in the stratosphere, the need to govern off the back of the need to research. Research also lays out a variety of futures, which states might find desirable and undesirable as well. The final thing I want to quickly talk about here is worst case scenarios. So one thing I do actually think that research might be very applicable for is, and has a strong knowledge gap, is in investigating global catastrophic and existential risk, both posed by and reduced by SRM. Both these worst case scenarios are very underexplored in both climate change and SRM. These include things like extreme warming and tipping points, That stuff's been a little bit more research, particularly the higher end of warming. But nonetheless, it also includes things like societal responses, both to climate change and to SRM. Interacting hazards. Okay, so how would SRM interact with something like a space weather event, perhaps causing termination shock? The geopolitical effect, which, as I said, I think is the biggest danger we have from SRM, and termination shock, which might only occur under certain conditions, but understanding which conditions it can occur and how to mitigate that might be really important as well. There's lots of research to be done here. And my sort of 2 cents is that we can do research in this area, particularly in a way that really doesn't increase the probability we deploy here. We might have important implications of global catastrophic and existential risk for governance, highlighting the need for global cooperation, highlighting the need, particularly of cooperation probably between the US and also the need for things in place that can give us guidance towards sort of the worst case end here. We also want to consider worst case scenarios because it's useful for robust risk analysis. It's important over a wide variety of ethical views to understand the worst case scenarios. And we might care about intergenerational justice or care for future generations, which might become particularly important when we're looking at the most extreme end of this, of these sort of worst case scenarios, both from climate change and from SRM. One thing I'd like to say here is, like, I think it's probably false to say that what we need is a mere blanket more research. As we've seen in this talk, some research can lead to very positive and some research can lead to very negative consequences. What we probably need is more of the right sorts of research, more of the, and how we generate the right sorts of research is a contested and should be a contested question. But not all research is created equally. Even the same research project with the same research question with the same results in a different political context, done by different people with a different framing, with different communication, can be different. So understanding that what we don't just need here is a blanket ban of research or a blanket, we need more research, but much rather selectivity about what sorts of research we do, how this co-evolves with governance, who is included in the conversation, and who gets to make these decisions are all probably vital in trying to make there be a future around SRM that we think is equitable, just, and flourishing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gideon. Fascinating talk there. Moving on now. Next, we have Mofis Rahman. He's an environmental scientist and educator, and he's currently working as a scientist at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. He's engaged in the past with the capacity of development of youth through teaching, and he brings his field research into the classroom to educate new generations using transdisciplinary methodologies and combining natural and social science disciplines. Over to you, Mofis.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashima, Hal, and Gideon. The discussion is so broad, so it's covered almost everything what I was thinking of. So what I would do now, I will tell you a story, which later I relate to SRM and SRM governance. So I'm not talking on behalf of Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, rather, I'm talking on behalf of Bangladesh, where I came from. And as you know, that Bangladesh is one of the climate victim countries in the world. And we also say that we are also very resilient in terms of adapting to the impact of climate. So the storyline is like this. So last decades, Bangladesh is developing enormously in terms of its economic growth and so on, because the country is going through a demographic dividends and so on. So if you look at the growth of GDP and other indicator, we are performing pretty good. But climate change have a large impact on the country, and the impact I would say so have two dimensions. So first dimension, over the last decades, the development we made, so the climatic impact is wiping out the thing we have done so far, and in many ways, and also it will hinder our future development. So last decades, we made few significant things. For example, we are building a nuclear power plant in our country. we also made a huge breeze, is one of the longest breeze on the river, Padda, which is the same, in India we'll call it Ganges. It's a huge river. We made a breeze on top of it. And then we are also launched a satellite for our national use. So why this story is interesting? So if you look at these three big things, so people are celebrating the breeze we made more compared to the nuclear power plant or compared to the satellite we launched, because satellite was launched in France. It's made by French scientists, so it's operated by them. And same for the nuclear power plant. It's mostly by Russians. They're helping us to build that. But the breeze is somehow, it has a long story. I'm not going for it, but the breeze, somehow people find there's some sort of ownership. So now I bring this story to the SRM context. My experience working in SRM in developing countries, and I feel there is no sense of ownership when it comes to SRM discussion. So people don't really feel this is something we own the idea. So this idea generated in Western academia, and then it's brought somehow, but still it's not really brought into a way that everybody knows about it. But it's very Western idea, which been discussed and researched in Western academia and Western Research Institute. So the three development indicator I told about Bangladesh, so Bangladeshi people and the politicians and the policymaker owns the breeze way better than other two infrastructure. And the reason is sense of ownership, because this was financed by our national authority. This was dream of many people. It's the demand from the citizens and so on. So then the next point I want to make this, we are a very adaptation focused country, like many developing countries are very adaptation focused. So there are few fears when it comes to SRM discussion. Number one, as I mentioned, the sense of ownership is lacking. Number two, so many people think the adaptation money is not there. So the adaptation, the demand for adaptation money is quite big, but the global plays is happening, but the money is not really flowing to support. So many people fear that SRM also might be competing. So if SRM research goes become popular, and then that might have a larger impact on adaptation research. And the third point is there's a problem with technological fix. So if there is a technological fix next door, close to you, so you might not do what you should be doing. For example, mitigation or changing behavior or so on. So the real root cause, as many of you mentioned, that SRM will not really address the root cause. So what we have to do is reducing carbon dioxide emission and reducing greenhouse gas emission and changing our behavior, and behavioral change can be a leverage for solving many climate problems. So if we see there is a technical fix, then we keep doing business as usual. So that's the third point. And the fourth, the reason I personally engage myself in SRM research is I think we should be better informed. It's not that we rely on all the time on the knowledge of few countries. Then the fifth point, what I would like to mention is so capacity development in many developing countries are quite low in the frontier of SRM. But I'm very sure that certain frontiers, for example, adaptation, many countries in developing world knows way better than Western academia. But when it comes to SRM, CDR, like certain technology, or certain modeling exercise and so on, so there is knowledge gap. And I think reducing the knowledge gap was one of my motivation to join the SRM community, to understand what's happening. It's help us to take our decision sometimes by ourselves, rather than relying completely on the knowledge provided by Western academia. And as my previous speaker says, that it's not always neutral. So there might be motivation behind certain research. So this politics of different scenario building, the politics of certain research agenda, we need to be very clear about, we need to be aware about. And also we have to educate our younger generation. It's not the way historically we thought. So adaptation is our thing, and motivation and mitigation and geoengineering and other technical fix will be done by Western world. So that's this dichotomy I don't like much, and that's one of the reason I get involved with this SRM research. So I was in the team of decimal grant research, and as Gideon mentioned, that degree initiative has given fund to several developing countries to do research. And in our research, we looked at SRM and non-SRM scenarios, and kind of in a risk framework, and which is many would argue, but without SRM there is risk, but SRM is also brings certain risk, but this trade-off need to be analyzed. And in many cases there are not enough research. So for example, in the context of health, so we were the first research project looked at malaria. I won't really go in technical details of the research findings, but just to mention that the research shows that it will protect high elevation population from Eastern African countries from malaria encroachment, but at the same time, it would increase the transmission in lowland in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia and other places. So the bottom line is, so even the SRM cool down the planet for certain in some way, but it won't really give benefit everybody equally. So some countries will be loser, some countries will be gainer. Same for the agriculture. So in agriculture, certain crop will be benefited, certain crop will be losing, and some countries will gain benefit through changes in rainfall and temperature, but some countries will not. So here comes the main question of governance. So who will benefit and who will lose? That remains very uncertain, and that remains sort of like the question of research. But I believe that youth have a role to play to understand all these risks. I'm not in favor or against the research, but I want to be well informed what's happening, and well, that's kind of I would say decolonization of the knowledge production and removing the knowledge barrier somehow. So I would stop here, and I'm looking forward for further discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Another great talk there. Next is actually me, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about some of the topics we've just gone over. I'd like to sort of preface this by sort of explaining some of my own views of SRM. And I found myself in a situation where I'm neither for or against research or deployment either, but I'm in the sort of process of exploring some of the options and exploring the different arguments for and against. But what I'd like to do now is sort of put forward some of the interesting arguments I've heard in the SRM debate, and also talk a lot about this sort of idea of youth perspectives and the role in that in the debate as well. So most science deals with modular phenomenon. And what I mean by this is you can test a vaccine and put that one person at risk without putting a whole population at risk. We have a lot of planetary wide goals. One of them is eradicating smallpox, for example. So we can test the sort of untold effects without full scale implementation with like a vaccine. The question here is, would this be the case for SRM? And I think that some of the proponents about the research are quite unclear about this sort of blurred boundary between research and deployment, which makes it very hard to make that assessment of that question. For example, if we embarked on these sort of decade-long experiments on the entire planet, would it be difficult to change sort of negative impacts if they were discovered along the way? In any case as well, these impacts themselves might be completely impossible to decipher from natural variability on the sort of timescales we'd be dealing with. And it's these sort of questions and the uncertainty and kind of how we go from research to deployment that makes me feel skeptical of SRM research, but also makes me want to know more about it. Another question is, if, say, those negative impacts were discovered, would there be incentives to sort of continue with SRM despite sort of dangerous impacts? And as Officer and Gideon mentioned earlier, the sort of dangerous idea of a termination effect. And that's something we kind of understand sort of in all forms of technology, sort of when a technology is taken away, the sort of effect that might have. Will that affect sort of a deployment of SRM? Does that increase incentive to keep going and not cancel a deployment once a negative impact has been found? The idea as well that a system like this could just be switched off, I also feel sort of goes against some of our concurrent understanding of these sort of large scale technical systems. It seems like from speaking with researchers and policymakers that these are notoriously difficult things to turn off and change and sort of go through processes of lock-in. Once you put so much funding into something and so much people's time, it seems like it's incredibly difficult to prevent things from stopping. And once you've gained the momentum. So I feel like this is illustrated best in sort of the stubbornness and the complex energy system we have at the moment that has resulted in global warming in the first place. In a sense, I feel like you could see this as a lock-in, that we've locked into sort of anthropogenic climate change just through how our financial and political system has set up the energy industry. I think it's really also important to consider the sort of vested interest that would accompany any sort of building of an enormous SRM infrastructure, and also the interest that goes into research itself. Speaking of those two, also the social systems and any sort of governance institutions and operational personnel that would be required to deploy SRM. And what I mean by that vested interest is the sort of, on one hand, it could be motivations for people to continue using SRM maliciously or continue researching SRM maliciously. And I think that's really key to understanding how complex it would be to either switch these sort of technologies off or switch off support for research. And I think that is a really, really key point to consider at the moment, because we are at a turning point where the support for SRM is very debated. So these are sort of things we need to consider now before we embark on sort of any research journey or any sort of deployment journey on a sort of global scale. And when thinking about these vested interests, I think also consider the sort of financial opportunities that SRM creates and how that has so much power to influence people. For example, if you develop an SRM technique, you can patent it. If you design the particles for release into the stratosphere, that is a product that you have developed. But the idea that there are large economies in this system, the delivery systems, the raw materials themselves, and the establishment of the funding schemes themselves are all part of this larger economic system. No young person is invested in the success of these systems. And I think this is the most powerful point when you talk about a youth perspective. We just simply aren't invested into the sort of avenues of this technology as people are who are working in the field. And that's why I think it's so important to consider these youth perspectives. Speaking more about young people, why else should we include youth in decision-making? This can be argued as, on a very basic level, intergenerational justice. Young people will have to deal with the extreme consequences of climate in the future. And for young people to be excluded in policy-making decisions does not seem fair to me. However, this sort of idea about arming the future or safeguarding future generations is the same debate that has been used to support SRM research and to support SRM technology. This can be done sometimes with good intentions, but I also think it's a particular argument that we should have caution around, because this idea of arming the future with SRM, I think, is flawed for a couple of reasons. And firstly, it's the one I've kind of discussed so far, which is this blurred line between research and deployment, which would make it almost impossible, but not entirely, to discuss research as though it was separate to deployment, which sort of, I feel like if you're making a case that SRM research is for young people, is for youth and to arm them, I think it's making some assumptions about the nature of deployment of SRM and the sort of risks that would be associated with that. But secondly, which is where I feel more passionately about, is that by selling research in SRM as a sort of tool for young people and why they should be interested in it is not defensible. And that is simply just because of it does not accurately reflect how technology emerges from society and becomes something that people can use usefully. And I think it makes an assumption that a developing technology emerges in society as a neutral agent and wouldn't adhere to any sort of social hierarchy we already have in place. Because I feel like these technologies, and SRM in particular, would always be co-produced with a sort of social hierarchy and the global hierarchy of equality that already exists. And I don't think this is an equitable support of future generations. I feel like if you argue that SRM research would help future generations, you're actually arguing that it would help certain youth in the world in the future, but not all of them. So some important questions to ask from this is, who would carry out this sort of research? What kind of social order would it create because of who it is co-produced with? Any attempts that we make to sort of carry out SRM research, would it adhere to this inherently political hierarchy we already have in place? And would it be favorable to young people in certain parts of the globe, but not the other? So, well, I think it's so important that we have this sort of a gathering like this where we can discuss youth perspectives. I do also think it's important to consider the disparities we already have in place all over the world, and that researching SRM and deploying it is inevitable is inevitably going to adhere to those inequalities that we are already in place. So I think it's potentially dangerous to just justify any research in SRM based on we need better informed policy for youth in the future. So to summarize that, I still feel like I'm maybe slightly pro-research, just because I'm a trained environmental scientist, and I do think that exploring knowledge gaps is important, and it is important for research in general is such a powerful tool. But whether this, whether it is justified as it is, I'm not completely sure. And yeah, just sort of general warning of how this idea of youth perspectives can be twisted in the wrong way, but are just so important at the same time. So it's another sort of source of debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hal. Thank you very much for your comprehensive discussion. And it's definitely important that you mentioned the questions to ask, the important questions to ask. Who is going to come to research? And now, as we continue to explore our exploration with solar radiation modification, we now turn our attention specifically to the governance frameworks that should be in place to ensure it's safe and responsible youth. With a particular focus on youth involvement, our next speaker is M. Sandhouse James. Just to give a short introduction of him, Ben Sandhouse James is energy conflict point Yango, the UNECE Youth Constituency. He works with a broad range of nonprofits promote systems into disciplinary approaches to solving the climate crisis. He has been involved with Yango for 3 years, previously serving on the global coordination team and leading the COP27 and COP26 energy and sustainable consumption and production global youth statements, respectively. He holds an MSc in energy systems from the University of Oxford, where his research focused on carbon removals, and a BSc in Earth Science Geophysics from Imperial College London. Ben works as a sustainability consultant across sustainable finance, carbon management, and climate safe, and has previous work experience in environmental policy and growth capital investing across energy transition and circular economic assets. Today, Ben will discuss governance frameworks and how we can better include young voices in the to ensure that the perspective and concerns are taken. So without further ado, let's welcome Ben to start with his introduction.
Thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here today. Firstly, thank you to the other panelists for their own inputs as well to this discussion. It's been a very, very interesting discussion so far, and hopefully we'll have a lot to live up to in terms of adding to that now. But I think there's a few things that I wanted to discuss. I wanted to discuss firstly a bit on the governance side from a broad sort of national and international perspective. And then I wanted to discuss more on the sort of youth engagement side, which we already touched upon a bit in both cases. So let's start with governance. So one problem that we've got more broadly across the climate space is that defining governance is really hard. The IPCC's terminology book defines governance as the way government is understood has changed in response to social, economic, and technological changes over recent decades. There's a corresponding shift from government defined strictly by the nation state to a more inclusive concept of governance to recognise the contributions of various levels of government and the roles of the private sector, of non-governmental actors, and of civil society. Not that useful, right? So how do we actually go about building an effective governance method? What does that look like? Well, right now, SRM is basically still in the concept stage. We have some modeling, which Ian's touched upon. We have some early stage plans, and we have a very preliminary experiment going on in the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. We are not anywhere close to readily available deployment, and we're even further off from sort of nth of a kind type technologies. And there's a big question over whether we ever will get to that stage and whether that's even desirable at all. But we can't really just keep our heads in the sand here. And what we've seen over the last few years is that when we've tried to raise SRM as a topic within the global governance sphere, we've got pushback. There was a resolution in 2019 at the UN Environment Assembly, which was vetoed by various state actors, and which the Swiss put forward with the support of about a dozen countries. And it was, the official wording was to prepare an assessment of the state of geoengineering techniques, in particular carbon dioxide removal technologies and solar radiation management. Now, that got voted down after several drafts, after the parties failed to reach an agreement on it. Since then, carbon removal has seen integration into processes within the UN through Article 6, and we're beginning to see some momentum gathering around those geoengineering techniques. What we're not seeing is we're not seeing the same momentum gather and coalesce around governance of solar radiation management, and that's a problem. Now, they aren't perfect comparisons. Carbon removal is going to be necessary to reach net zero emissions. Solar radiation management is a technology of last resort. It's not something we want to use, but it's also something that we might have to in the worst case. But there is that broad consensus that it should be that last resort technology. Now, the problem here is that the world simply can't wait lying down until we get to that point where we need to deploy it, if we need to deploy it, to actually define the governance structure. Whether you think it's a good idea or not, we need to avoid this kind of self-delusion and this idea of this alluring ignorance to buy into this narrative that net zero will easily be achieved by 2050. We definitely won't need it. Human ingenuity will try. That's great. Hopefully it will happen. But we should be wary of such fairy tales. And we should be even aware of the potential for quick fix geoengineering methods, both in terms of deployment, but also in terms of governance. We do not want to get to a state where we are rushing SRM without robust governance structures. And if it's misdeployed, if it's abused, if it's misused, it may lead to, even at an early stage, even with early stage national plans, and we're beginning to see this in terms of unilateral plans by individual governments, then we might see public trust in which is already very low in solar geoengineering, even more undermined. And because of that, we need to promote a conversation on this. We've seen this with carbon removal. We've seen that you can engage the public, you can make them aware. You need to get active participation rather than just thinking that you can supply information, so an information deficit model, and move towards a participatory model where we engage public stakeholders on the conversation, on the pros and cons, and have a broad governance discussion about this. That goes beyond the UN system. It requires interdisciplinary cooperation. It requires cooperation across non-governmental stakeholders, and it also requires intergenerational cooperation as well, which I'll touch upon in a bit. Now, what does a good governance principle look? What does a good set of governance principles look like? Now, there is some academic research out there looking at this. So, for example, there's the Oxford Principles on Geoengineering. So quickly, there's 5 principles there. Firstly, geoengineering should be regulated as a public good, rather than in private interests and private capture. Principle 2 is that there should be public participation in geoengineering decision making, which we've touched on a bit. Principle 3 is the disclosure of geoengineering research and open publication of results. The 4th is the independent assessment of impacts without other motivations. And finally, 5, which is this overarching principle that you need to govern, you need to put in governance structures before deployment. And what are some of the risks if we don't? Well, some of the other panelists have touched upon this a little bit, but to me, the key one is around unilateral action. It's around a national government coming up with its own defined governance structures. We've seen this with other new technologies. We've seen it with AI. We've seen it with, to take a more blue skies example, with space mining and space resources. And there's a real risk that if it is done unilaterally, the adverse impacts are not considered because they are not impacting that one country. And there's a whole range of potential counterfactual scenarios where the world ends up in a really bad state with potential for conflict and war if you get SRM wrong. I think the other side of it, aside from national government interests versus global interests, is around fossil fuels and more generally malicious actors being able to capture this and viewing it as a get out of jail free card and being able to effectively get to a state where it is justifying delays in emissions, distracting from those actual emission reductions and mitigation that needs to be done, but also potentially blighting the reputation of the technology more generally. And I think that's a problem. I think we need to avoid that situation where we get into the path dependency, but I think we also need to avoid getting into a situation where SRM is viewed too negatively as it's a corporate interest, corporate capture interest. I think there is a world in which that happens. And because of that, in general, the consensus that I have seen within the SRM community is more that we are focusing on how can this be done within the public sector and adjacent to the public sector, rather than looking at this as a private sector tool for now. Now, that's hard and that's not easy to do. But at the extreme end of this, there's currently a number of campaigns looking at the Rome Statute for International Criminal Court and bringing ecocide into the International Criminal Court. Now, I think there's an interesting debate in itself whether that is a worthy idea. But if you are looking at the misuse of SRM, particularly the adverse impacts, then potentially that will qualify under that. There's also, as Gideon has touched upon, some major concerns when it comes to existing multilateral principles. So how do you overcome the Montreal Protocol and Vienna Convention to protect the ozone layer? If you're injecting stratospheric aerosols into the stratosphere, how do you deal with that? There will need to be governance reform, and the larger scale, the more transnational SRM technique that you are employing, the more difficult it is. The more localized techniques, where you are looking maybe at marine cloud brightening and things like that, they can probably be governed predominantly through national means. When you are looking at SRM that is affecting the overall climatic system on a global scale, that is a big problem. And there is no way to do that without putting in place a governance structure. And with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit, a couple of minutes, about how young people can actually work on this. I think with such topics, you've got a major challenge of engaging young people on them, building the next generation inputs from across different disciplines and backgrounds around what is a very technical topic and one that is not easy to grasp, but ensuring that we empower and we equip and we build capacity for young people, whether they are chemical engineers, whether they are in law, whether they are in economics. We need to get a diverse group of people who are from across the world who are interested and who are passionate about this. And then we need to get them into positions where they are influencing policy. They are getting this on the agenda at the UN meetings, building broad coalitions, potentially engaging the private sector. And I think there is a roadmap there, which we have to expand upon, with how things have gone with Article 6 and how we've actually been able to get carbon removal on the map at the UN through what young people have done. But I'll leave you with a few thoughts. So a couple of questions. I think my first question here is, when we think about this potential for overshoot, which the IPCC has made abundantly clear in its latest AR6, the sixth assessment report, the summary of policymakers that's just come out, when we exceed our carbon budget, there are two overarching questions to consider. Who will experience the worst impacts of climate change? It's not predominantly the ones making the rules today, and it's not predominantly the ones making the rules in the future. It's predominantly the global south, it's predominantly the people who are not in control necessarily of SRM and not necessarily likely to have governments that will be the first movers here, but also who will be responsible for coming up with solutions to mitigate the overshoot. And in that respect, this is this next generation of young people that will be leading the charge there. And with that, we need to build coalitions, we need to empower young people, and it's webinars and initiatives like this that are hopefully taking one step in the right direction to getting us there. Thank you.
So, yes, we need to come to a balance when we talk about SRM discussions, and definitely we need youth to take part in that. In this discussion, as youth are imperative of our future, right? So I'm sure that your discussion, your points have given the audience much to consider. Now we would like to hear from all of you through a quick poll again. This is our last poll, and the poll question should be visible now. Did you post the poll question? Yes, great. So now the poll question is, how do you feel in general about solar radiation modification being considered as an additional measure to address the negative impacts caused by climate change? Do you feel optimistic? Are you very hopeful and positive about it? Or are you skeptical? You're in doubt. Or are you neutral? You're neither for or nor against. Or are you concerned that this discussion makes you anxious and worried that how it will possibly take place with proper governance? Or this discussion makes you outraged that why are we even considering discussion? So please vote your polls, and then we will be able to see the answers and see how do you feel in general about this discussion overall. Great. So concern comes the most. 60% of people is concerned. Neutral is very less. And optimistic, we see a good number of optimism, but yeah, more is skeptical. And outrage, yes, neutral, outrage are the same number. Great. So personally, to me, I'm also a bit skeptical when these discussions arise regarding the governance and how we can, as a global world, we can work towards transparent, just, and equitable governance framework. It makes me very skeptical. Now it would be our question and answer session. I can see that there is a couple of questions, but anyway, I would hand the floor to Sarah and also to Rebecca to coordinate the question and answer session. And all the speakers, if you could kindly take up with the answers and respect.
Thank you, Asma. I think let me just go. I'm Korit Sarah, part of the C2G project. Let me just go straight to the questions. We have a few questions from the Q&A session. The first question I would like to direct it to Gideon. The question is, what are the odds that SRM will become geoengineering terrorism?
I'm not entirely sure what that question is meant to mean. If the person who asked it could provide some clarification in the chat, because at the moment I'm not quite sure what geoengineering terrorism means. I think one thing I think it's quite clear is that there is clear potential for worries around SRM. I think to, whether rightfully or wrongly, to cause and promote terrorism. So that you see some of the rhetoric around SRM already rising. People who think that we're already carrying this out and already destroying nature and things like this. And the rhetoric can and does get quite heated. So I can imagine in a world where we were carrying out SRM, that terroristic worries around it might be rather might be a relatively serious concern. Although you have to also weigh this around things like eco-terrorism in a world of climate change as well, which also seems like pretty decently plausible. One thing that you have around SRM, which you have less around climate change, is you have a clear group of people whose fault it is, who are acting right now. So do it. Oh, so they've clarified in the chat how SRM will be used as a new tool to cause terrorism. No, I don't see SRM as a way of, there is no decent way to weaponize SRM in that sense. But SRM could act as a catalyst for terrorism. Although in reducing climate impacts, it could also act as a way of reducing that. Although my bets would be that under a world of carrying on SRM, there would be more eco-terrorism, and then in a world where we had like 2 degrees of warming without SRM.
Thank you, Gideon, for the response. The next question, I think either Hal or Gideon will take this. The question is, how can co-evaluation of governance and SRM research provide and political legitimacy?
Sorry, Sarah, I think you cut out a little bit there. But
Okay, I think I can answer the question. So It's how can co-evaluation of governance and SRM research provide a chance for responsibly developing SRM approaches with broader public participation and political legitimacy? Yeah, so how would the governance of SRM research provide a chance for co-evaluation could exist? How would it be possible with broader public participation and political legitimacy? For responsibly developing.
I might hand that to Gideon, I think, to give a good answer to that.
So yeah, I think it's quite clear that the co-evolution of research, well, how research has created the political legitimacy for SRM governance thus far. There's this question of like, how can this be done responsibly? And I think a lot of this depends on your definition of what is responsible. It will be, to some extent, and always is, impossible to have full public participation in this. But nonetheless, we can broaden the horizons of the people who are in the room that get to make the decisions around SRM, broaden the discussions so that the futures that we make and that we think about with SRM are not just a narrow range of people. And there has been efforts to expand this. But, you know, we've quite a lot of evidence now that like understanding political legitimacy of interventions and other things like this are like contingent on broad public outreach. But sometimes this can still be really hard in these early forming stages because we won't know who always the most important political coalitions. We can say the political coalitions we want to engage with now, we think are an ethical obligation for whatever justice concerns or whatever. This might not provide lasting political legitimacy though, because we don't actually know always who the most important constituencies will be in making sure SRM can carry on without broad public backlash and can maintain its legitimacy. Nonetheless, and also we might say there's like, if you're wanting to build political legitimacy for SRM, it seems unlikely that chemtrailers are going to be part of that coalition. Nonetheless, they might be a very important group in terms of stoking discontent at SRM. So I think it's basically very difficult to, in a sort of anticipatory sense, we can do better than we are doing now by conversations like this and making it broader as well, you know, broadening it beyond people who just know their stuff or are experts to a broader range of groups, more conversation in the public domain in a way that is also a little bit more like equal, but I don't ever think this can be perfect and perfectly responsibly generate political legitimacy.
Thank you again, Gideon, for the response. And this goes to all the panelists. Anyone can take it up. So the question is, considering the first phase at which SRM is evolving, should it be a concern that research and development of these technologies will outpace governance?
I can ask it again. So the question is, considering how we are in a fast phase with the SRM research and development that is taking place, shouldn't we be concerned that it can outpace the governance that we might need for it? Over to you, Ben.
Yeah, happy to take this. I agree. I think most of us would agree. I think that's the short answer. I think there is a real concern that research outpaces governance, and this is to Gideon's point that you sort of need both in parallel happening at the same time. But actually, as research scales, you do need basic governance principles, whether that's a moratorium, an immediate moratorium, or something similar, to ensure that on anything larger scale, to ensure that you don't have potentially adverse consequences or malicious actors taking advantage of it. Now, that doesn't mean that the government should be hindering the research directly. And there's a role to consider of what correct governance looks like that allows responsible research to, I'm not sure I want to use the word flourish, but to take place and to be able to establish itself so that we can learn more about the technology whilst avoiding the potential for large-scale deployments at this time. And I think Gideon will probably have some views on what that might look like.
I just want to quickly add one point. So I miss one angle. So there is also research governance angle, like what should we research, and shall we research the deployment process, the technology, or the research on impact and so on. So research is not one thing. It's a broad spectrum of research is required. So I think there is some sort of research governance is also required. Yeah, so that's my view.
I think there is quite a lot of research going on into potential governance techniques right now. We'll be interested to hear whether the other panelists disagree with this, but to me, actually the problem, whilst it's always great to have more thoughts around what a good appropriate governance structure should look like, to me the problem is less we don't have an idea, and it's more actually getting people to do something about it and getting it into both national and international systems. Would be interested to hear what the other panelists think about.
I'm also seeing a question in the chat. One of our participants is asking, the question is, lots of organizations and academics recognize SRM as a dangerous distraction. How can these actors and those actors and perspectives be involved in the conversation more to help with early risk identification?
I'm happy to somewhat answer this. I basically think those actors, not all of them, but to a large extent, are involved in the conversation, actually, and have historically been quite a powerful voice in the conversation. I don't think always to the greatest extent, and often they've been involved in the conversation because they've pushed themselves to be involved. To look at the way that, for instance, the SAMI were not originally included in the conversation around ScopeX and pushed themselves to be involved. But nonetheless, I would say, put broadly, a substantial number of the academics who will be attending workshops and conferences on SRM would be skeptical of SRM as a dangerous distraction and are given research money and included in the conversation, invited to workshops and things like this. Sure, there might still be more ways to do this, but I don't think they're quite as excluded as that question makes out. Some groups still are, and sometimes those groups, as I said, like the SAMI, do make an effort and push themselves to be included in a way that I think is commendable. But I think in general, the sort of academics working on this aren't excluded.
Yeah, I'd have to agree there that some of the really key organizations and a lot of people working in the field do have like a voice in sort of the contribution to identifying risk. But maybe I'd quite like to build on this question a little bit, that what about some of the other perspectives and other actors who are legitimate, say like activism, which are maybe not as involved with the sort of early risk identification?
Yeah, I just want to add a point. I see any other sector also have the similar problem. For example, the IPCC also have discussion about inclusiveness. So it's not only SRM. So it start from a group, then over the time it grows a community and the discussion and debate. So, for example, when I look at GMO or other controversial issue, so they're always complain about the factor of inclusion and so on. Yeah, so this discussion I'm listening quite often, that's a distraction. Yeah, but I think this discussion is going broad, and the people who are doing research, they're not really, many of them I know personally are not pushing something or advocating something. They're
I think we have lost almost it. In the meanwhile, I think we can carry on with the question. So it's pretty interesting. So one of the governance challenges of SRM often mentioned is the risk to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. However, the Sustainable Development Goals will expire in 2030. Why is there such an emphasis on the SDGs when SRM and CDR technologies are expected to be used on a longer term? Anyone wish to take it? Coming up with SDGs and why are we giving it so much importance?
Maybe we don't have an answer for that by sort of the sounds of it, which is something I'd also kind of like to point out that, you know, this panel isn't an all-inclusive like board on what we should do on SRM. These are some of these are youth perspectives on it. And, you know, unfortunately, there are like some questions we're just not going to be able to answer. But just through looking through the Q&A, I have noticed some sort of topic that we might be able to discuss. And this is to do with the sort of gender balance of these arguments. And I think it is definitely relevant when we're considering youth perspectives as well, because it is you could argue it is a underrepresented group of people. So considering our talks today have been mostly by almost entirely male, I will note that we did have a female speaker did have to cancel at the last minute, but I'd quite like if we could as a sort of panel discuss this for a moment, because I feel like there is some sort of feeling in the attendees at the moment that this is not a diverse representation. And I think if we're going to talk about youth perspectives and why they're important, we need to talk about diversity as a whole as well. So I'd be really interested if some of the other panelists could maybe give their take on that as well.
So yeah, there's a couple of things I probably would like to say about this, which is something like, firstly, like we are not representative youth perspectives. You know, also we are what, like 5 people. That's never going to represent all the youth of the world. We are some young people that have some perspectives. There are young people who probably think that my perspective is deeply immoral and terrible, and other young people that think it's the most amazing thing ever. You know, we're just some people, and yeah, we do need like more of some people to be able to be incorporated in discussions from more backgrounds. And I basically cannot agree more there. And there clearly is a gender balance issue in general in SRM. I would like to say that like sometimes when this gender balance issue gets brought up, it acts to flatten and eliminate the role that some like very senior and important female scholars have had in the development of the field, which I often find is like pretty reprehensible, given that there is some of the leading scholars in this field are women. But yeah, if you just look at publication biases, it's just like quite clear that it skews white male. Work needs to be done to improve this inclusiveness, but also we need to recognize that, you know, no small group of scientists or anything like this is going to be representative of the whole world, and no panel like this is going to be presenting youth perspectives at all. It's going to be perspectives of some young people.
Yeah, I agree with. Yeah, like the way I see it, like our views are defined by many factors. Our education, or where we come from, like, you know, which are socioeconomic condition you live, so the population you interact with, your national interest. So a lot of things actually influence the way we frame something. So I think the view of a few people will never be representative of view of everybody. But I think this theme is gaining interest, and a lot of people will interact and discuss and debate, and I think that's the future. Thank you.
Okay, so one discussion that I really want to pick up is so we talk about small scale research when we talk about SRM, right? So is there anything called as small scale research? And even if we do small scale research, would that be beneficial or effective when we go to the larger deployment of it?
I think I'm like, I know I've spoken a little bit. I think I'm quite happy to talk about this, given I've been just coming off the back of a research project on this. I think it's like when we talk about small scale research, in general, we talk about small scale outdoor experimentation. And I think I'm skeptical that small scale outdoor experimentation is that important in terms of like causing a slippery slope or moral hazard. I think the arguments that is that important is like not that is pretty are pretty weak. I think once you start getting to large scale experimentation with reasonable radiative forcing impact, then there's another word you can have for that sort of large scale experimentation, which is small scale deployment. And I think there is no really good line you can draw between large scale experimentation that has like a meaningful radiative impact and has like a clear pathway to deployment. From deployment, I think there's a strong line that you can take between doing some outdoor experiments that don't have a radiative impact that is meaningful and are rather to explore aerosol properties or to explore cloud properties and deployment, partially because we're carrying out these experiments already. We just don't call them SRM. There's a bunch of ways. So I've been part of a project where we got a bunch of experimentalists to propose some experiments and then looked. And then I went through the literature and looked to see whether experiments that looked physically the same had happened before. And for essentially every single example of an SRM experiment we were given, another experiment that wasn't an SRM experiment but nonetheless physically looked the exact same had been carried out. So that's one reason I don't think the sort of risks around low environmental impact experimentation is always the best place to focus. We can learn some stuff. As I said, we do have some fundamental physical uncertainties, and these will be able to improve our models. But again, how much that's the really relevant risks versus the social risk is very different. And the fact that we draw this strong distinction in terms of like danger and things like this between like indoor models and outdoor experiments seems like weird to me, because issues of moral hazard, slippery slope, all of this stuff can be just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, with indoor experimental models as it can be with outdoor experiments. And this isn't to say that we shouldn't do this. Just acknowledging that something has dangers is not good enough to say we shouldn't do it. And there might be really good reason to run certain models. I think there are. Really good reasons, but it does mean that we need to be selective over what sort of things we run, and etc. Basically.
I think we will take just one more question and then we'll go to our closing remarks. So the last question that we can address is indigenous communities have a relationship to nature that is often underrepresented and misunderstood. So we do see the indigenous community, the Sami Council, going against OPEX and whatnot. So how can we better include them in some discussions?
I would just say, kind of relating that question to the intentions behind us gathering today, is that by gathering young people together, you can form a very powerful new perspective, which can completely change how you view the impact of a system. So it seems to me like this is an effective way of considering sort of the tangible effects you're going to have on more than just the group of people that you're from. So I'd say, with reference to how to sort of engage communities more, they need to be in the sort of in the debate, just like how we are young people here today involved in the debate as well. So I think, yeah, sort of inclusivity and really participating in high level debate is one of the most important things we can do.
Anyone wants to add it? If not, okay, yeah, sure.
Happy to do so. I would fully echo that, and I think this comes to the point that I mentioned earlier, that the people who are likely to be deploying SRM, if it ever happens, are likely not to be the people who are going to be impacted, one, by climate change, and two, potentially by the adverse impacts of it. So I think, yes, so that definitely fully agree on the point of Indigenous groups, but I think it's also a more general point as well about the Global South and about marginalised communities more generally, that we need to involve those voices, and that involves widening the discussion and bringing those voices in, and that is a challenge, but one that we need to do.
They shouldn't talk about SRM, but they come with a false hope that, okay, we are not going to overshoot. We will not go at that level. But when clearly we are not on track to the Paris Agreement, and we are going to overshoot. So what discussions do they come up with when they're saying that don't talk about SRM, and what else solutions we can talk about when we'll be in a position of overshoot and facing disastrous climate effects? Any thoughts or ideas on that?
Actually, I did not hear the first part of your question. So yeah.
Oh, I was just trying to mention that there is a group of people who keeps up saying that we won't overshoot. But clearly, when we are on a track, we are not on track with the Paris Agreement, and we are talking about SRM discussions at a point when we would overshoot. So how to bring up discussions on that point? I mean, what solutions we are else talking about when they're saying that we will reach an overshoot point? That's a perspective that we come across a lot, and that is just what I wanted to point out. And for now, I think I would ask our panelists to give some closing remarks, and then we can end our discussion. So I think we can start with Ben.
Sure, happy to. So I think we've had a really good, productive conversation today. I think it's very clear that there are significant gaps in terms of both this conversation, where we need to bring in more voices and different voices as well going forward, but also gaps in the research agenda, gaps in the governance agenda, and gaps more generally about how we engage a wider community and a wider audience with the topic beyond this immediate SRM bubble. And I think that really is the challenge. If we want this to become mainstream, if we want this to become something that gets on the policy agenda, on the political agenda, on the national, on the national and international scale, but also through nonprofit, through academia, then we need to think about how can we get people to engage with this? How can we get people to actively think about this? Whether they are proponents or against SRM, we need to promote a conversation. And that's why things like today are so valuable.
Hi. I think this kind of conversation is extremely crucial. It's not only in the scientific level, as every level this conversation is essential, because this will have large impact the way we design the research agenda, the funding, and so on. So I think in every level, starting from youth to indigenous community to scientific community, as well as policymakers, and every level we need broader discussion on SRM. Yeah, and I think that is extremely essential. It's not that only science community working on it and then the outcome comes. So it's not the one way, it should be both way. The science should inform the policy, but at the same time, people's voice should also come to the scientific community to design, like, what is the demand, what is the need, what are the societal response. I think it should be both way. Otherwise, there's a high possibility to things can go wrong. Thank you.
Your closing remarks.
My closing remarks are going to perhaps be slightly less profound than the other two, which is just this issue is really, really complicated. We are faced here with tremendous amounts of risk in any action we do. We are faced here with, on the one hand, a changing climate, which can pose all sorts of dangers contingent on human action on both mitigation and adaptation. On the other hand, here we're faced with SRM, a technology that could reduce some of those physical climatic damages, but comes with its own justice, equity concerns, as well as concerns around geopolitical impacts in particular. We have research here which is not neutral and which, depending on how we do it, what we do and how we do research and what we do and how we do governance, pushes the world closer or further from any of the plethora of outcomes. And we're in a position where we don't know which of those outcomes there are and which of those outcomes our actions will take us to, and which are not desirable. This just makes it really hard. And we need to, and there's no quick fixes to that. It's clear that I think that we can take governance approaches whilst recognizing that even taking those governance approaches shuts down possible futures, but then not taking those governance approaches shuts down other futures. I've not got a good answer for how we sort this out. It's just really difficult and really hard.
Thank you. Over to you, Hal.
Yeah, just want to express gratitude for everyone joining today, all the panelists and attendees. Thank you very much, because we're at a point in time where these discussions are immensely valuable, and this type of debate and different opinions are just so important to be kind of involved at an early stage. And I'd say if there's any sort of young people in the audience that your voice will be heard, like you can engage in these sort of topics, and it is really important to kind of get involved, because it's at a point where it is really useful, because there is still a debate going on. But saying that, I do think it is really important to have an open mind. I feel like we've seen some really opposite ends of the debate, just even in this like really small session. So participating with an open mind is almost just as important as participating itself. So I'd encourage people to participate. I'm very thankful for everyone being here, but I think that's sort of the best way forward. So thanks again.
Thank you very much. So as we come to the end of our meeting today, and just discussions on SRM, the critical role young people can play in the process cannot be like. In conclusion, I want to thank our distinguished speakers for sharing their valuable insights and our audience for their active participation. I hope this event has been a thought-provoking and enriching experience for everyone, and that we can continue to work together towards a sustainable future. Everyone, thank you very much.